Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Welcome back to these sessions where we are discussing the counter narrative with regard to religion and the state that has been developed or put forward by Javed Ahmed Ghamidi in a series of lectures that he gave in Dallas in 2015. If you have stuck with us up to this point, you know in the series of lectures that have come previously that we have gone through the traditional narrative as Javed Ghamidi understands it and his sort of structuring of what this narrative is and what its most important, its most salient points are. And now we have moved into the counter narrative that he has come up with, or that he himself feels as though is the correct understanding of the relationship between religion and the state, according to the sources, the key sources of Islam and Islamic religion, law, theology, etc., which for him and for the rest of the Muslim Ummah as a baseline is the Quran as a sacred text revealed by God, and the prophetic tradition or the sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. So on that basis, in the last session, what we did was we started this discussion or continued the discussion with regard to the counter narrative, the alternative narrative, if you will, or other narrative, or what Ghamidi Saab would call the true narrative of Islam's relationship with the state, that he put forward in an article he wrote in 2015 that was published in both Urdu and English in Pakistani newspapers. And there are 10 key points. We had gone through point number 1. And point number 1 that we talked about in the last session was the idea it is put forward as part of the traditional narrative and in our traditional understanding of the relationship between religion and the state, that the state has to have a religion. But in fact, Ghamidi says this is a new thing, that it has no basis really in the Quran or Sunnah, that it was put forward by, most prominently by Maulana Maududi, and then gained prominence worldwide from there. And in Pakistan, the sort of consequence of this was that the state then had to convert into an Islamic Republic of Pakistan. And that in essence, in order for the state to have a religion, then it has to go through the process that an individual would go through to become Muslim. The state has to become Muslim in that way as well. So the state has to convert. And so then the state converts by becoming an Islamic Republic of Pakistan. There's a passing of the objectives resolution that makes the state officially Muslim and then requires that no laws be passed there against the Quran and the Sunnah. For Ghamidi Saab, there's no basis for having to do this to the state in the Quran, in the Sunnah, in the Islamic sources, right? That for him, there's no basis in religion, in Islamic faith and religion, to require doing this to a state. In addition to that, he makes the point that the result of this act that was done, of this sort of process that the state of Pakistan went through, was it made non-Muslims second-class citizens within the country and completely destroyed the very basic idea of a republic, which is the notion of equal citizenship. So essentially, he's putting forward the idea that this notion of an Islamic republic is at its core contradictory in many respects. Okay, so that's the first point that we went through or the prior session, sorry. Now we move to the second point, right? And the second point is this idea that revolves around the notion of Khilafah or the Caliphate, right? And what Ghamidi contends is that this idea of Khilafah is not itself a religious term, right? That Khilafah or the Caliphate does not have any religious imperative behind it, right? It can be, he says, the dream of all Muslims, that all Muslim states form together into a united state of Muslims, right? That can be the dream, right? And in in the modern world, what has happened is you've had the establishment of nation states. But prior to this, states were created through conquest, right? And the states that have come into existence almost everywhere, they are products of sort of this prior conquest, which now have moved into this form of nation states with these fixed borders, etc. And that the sort of this process, this idea of nation states and the type of states that you're going to have, etc., that these are political processes. There's no religious imperative as to the type of state that needs to exist, is essentially what Ghamidi seems to be saying, right? And what he is saying is that many states you'll see in the world are essentially either now sort of nation state republics or in the process of getting there, or they may have shades of empire to them, but they're essentially moving towards or in line with this modern notion of the nation state. And fundamentally, he doesn't see any real issue with that religiously. There may be sort of political critique of that he has. He hasn't kind of articulated it necessarily, although based on his other writings, you can see that he does have a bit of a critique of that as to sort of how world governance might be. What he is really trying to emphasize is that there is a process that has gone on, which is sort of separate from this world of empire that used to exist. And so he goes through in his kind of discussion of the counter narrative what he calls the steps that have occurred with this new form, this new political entity that has come about. The first in the modern world has been this establishment of the nation state. The second step has been the creation of blocks of nation states, right? That there's been this development that's occurred in the post-empire era, which has been initially the creation of kind of individual states with borders, etc. And then the next stage has been the creation of blocks of nation states, like the European Union, for instance, where states feel as though they have some neighboring countries, other countries that share their interests, maybe even share cultures that kind of resonate with each other, and have decided that they want to collectively make some decisions together, right? So in Ghamdi's view, which he sort of puts forward, it seems as though the world is moving towards some type of global government at some point. And the United Nations as an entity is in some respects part of this process as well, right? And he spends a little bit of time discussing this, where he talks about the fact that the move to global government begins with the world at this first stage having kind of nation states everywhere, right? Even if there are some places that are kind of in flux as to the type of state they are, but they are legally and constitutionally nation states, and going through internal battles, so Pakistan and India being prime examples that are kind of struggling with being a republic, being a nation state, talking about equal citizenship, but at the same time having identities as Muslim or Hindu states, right? So the notion of Pakistan as a Muslim majority state, or India as a Hindu majority state that is dealing with the sort of issues that come up with giving due credence to that particular identity while also being a modern nation state with equal citizenship. So this touches into the notions of what is a secular state, how does that play out? And he says you see that this is partly the first stage in this move towards global government, is getting into, in these nation states, the idea of equal citizenship, getting to that point, getting away from sort of this rule by a majority identity and that supremacy idea, and moving towards equal citizenship. The second stage, which he talks about then, is the creation of these groups of nations. They cooperate for economic or other reasons, European Union again being the one. But even here, he says that there's still a lot of debate as to whether certain nations want to participate in these blocs or not. Brexit being a prime example, right? And what are the pros and cons of having this type of unity, right? So it's one thing to talk about equal citizenship within a particular nation state. The second stage that he's essentially articulating that occurs and that we see happening is speaking of kind of an equal citizenship between nations, right? So you're within the European Union, and regardless of what country you are, you're able to move around freely, right? You're able to have sort of the same economic opportunities, right? The same sort of social constraints or social rights or whatever else as other nations in that bloc that there's a shared interest and maybe cultural resonance with, right? That's the second stage, that expansion of that kind of equalness among citizens of different nations as well. And the third stage in Ghamdi's view is the creation eventually of a global government, and the UN he sees as kind of a pathway to this. When that happens or if that happens separately, but that's kind of how he sees this type of development. Now, all of this he is saying in order to point out the fact that the suggestion that a type of union among Muslim states in itself is not an objectionable thing. That in fact, we can certainly work towards this. If you want to call it a caliphate, okay, right? The notion of Muslim states all coming together is not an objectionable thing. Right? He talks about the fact that Jamal al-Din Afghani tried to push in this direction in the 19th century. And he says, as Muslims, we can dream of this, right? We can dream of this. We can move towards this as kind of a political goal. But the idea that this is some type of directive of the faith, that it's a directive, a religious directive, an obligation, a requirement for us to establish this union, this caliphate, that, he says, from a religious standpoint is baseless, right? Is baseless. Right? Something coming into existence in a natural, organic way is one thing, but something being a rule or requirement, a hukum of the Sharia, right? That's a different thing. And to say that the establishment of a caliphate is a natural or something that is a desire that Muslims will have, or sort of a natural way they want to go, sure. But he says to say that this is required by the Sharia, in Ghamdi's view, this is baseless, right? And it's important because if you say that, he says, if you say that it's a requirement and a rule of the Sharia that you must establish this caliphate, then refusing to do that, refusing to work for that and put all your effort towards that would essentially make you a sinner. And he says that is simply not the case. Refusing to work towards the establishment of the caliphate does not make you a sinner, according to Ghamdi. Right? There are many good things, he says, that people should strive for. And this could be seen, establishment of a caliphate, he said, could be seen as a good thing, right? That people should strive for. But that does not mean that they then become automatically religious directives, right? The idea that the notion that gets put out there, that the Sharia says all Muslims should be in one government. Ghamdi Sahib says that this has no backing from the Quran or Sunnah at all, right? And he would arguably note that those who might put forward some arguments from there typically can point to nothing except they'll put forward verses or parts of the Sunnah that they've actually misinterpreted, misread, or misapplied. Right? Now, there's another argument that gets put forward, right? Where some people might say, in Ghamdi's view, some people may say, well, look, the existence of several countries, or, many, dozens of countries that are Muslim, actually causes harm to Muslims. That in fact, and this harm we can get rid of it if we end up creating one union, one sort of caliphate. So some could say that, right? However, this notion that the existence of several countries is causing harm to Muslims, the idea that harm is being caused to Muslims, religious directives are not based, in Ghamdi's view, on the notion of benefit or harm. right? They're not based on the notion of whether something causes benefit or something or harm accrues from it, right? That's not how religious directives are constructed. He'll say, for instance, cigarette smoking is also harmful, according to religion. But that is not the concern of religion, right? The individual has to make their choice whether to smoke or not. Religion simply doesn't interfere here, right? And you could, to sort of move in this direction a little bit, even within traditional jurisprudence, what ends up happening then is the construction of these different categories of wrongful behavior, right? So you've got obligatory behavior and you've got haram, prohibited behavior. But in between, the jurists have created categories where they can't categorically say this is obligated, they can't categorically say this is prohibited, but they can sort of offer an opinion with regard to it based on their reading of Sharia as to whether this thing should be encouraged or not, it should be discouraged, etc. They cannot classify it as prohibited, but they might say, hey, it's not a good thing. That's what they do with cigarette smoking, right? But for Ghamidi, that's the jurist kind of construction. Religion itself, the Quran itself, the Sunnah itself is not concerned with creating directives on the basis of the notion of whether there's a benefit or harm that accrues from it. That's simply not it. Religious directives are based on questions of morality and immorality. In Ghamdi's view, that is how religious directives are constructed, right? So for instance, some people raise the issue that the Quran says that the harms of liquor are more than its benefits, and hence it's prohibited. And Ghamidi says, actually, the Quran says no such thing. The Quran does not speak about liquor in this way, about alcohol in this way. The Quran is not speaking about alcohol's harms being more than its benefits. What does the Quran actually say? The Quran actually says, Ghamidi points out, that the sin of the sin of alcohol is far greater than its benefit. Right? The sin is far greater than its benefit. That sin and harm are two different things. Sin is indicative of this moral question that religious directives are concerned with. They are concerned with the morality and immorality of something. And so when the Quran is talking about alcohol, Ghamidi points out that what the Quran is talking about is that the moral question, the immorality, the sin of alcohol is far greater than its benefit. Not some harm that's caused by it, right? No. The Quran, he says, has no concern over the physical harms of liquor. That's a concern of medicine, right? The Quran is talking about moral issues get created through the drinking of alcohol, right? Particularly getting to that stage of intoxication, of drunkenness, and the sort of moral issues that arise from that. Right? The benefits spoken about, if we want to speak about benefit here, are not health related. They're not health benefits of drinking alcohol itself. Right? It's not sort of the idea that, these latest studies are showing, or some studies, not even the latest ones, are showing that if you have a glass of red wine, that it's good for your heart. That is not the benefit that the Quran is speaking about. Right? The benefits that are being spoken about are moral benefits, right? It's speaking to the fact that back in the day, for instance, in the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and even prior to that, people would gather to gamble and drink, and they'd get drunk. And then oftentimes they would slaughter camels and distribute the meat to the poor. And this distribution of meat to the poor, when these people were drunk and they're killing camels and all that, that this distribution of meat to the poor, that is being referenced as a benefit here in the Quran, in Ghamdi's view. That is the sort of the ta'wil, the explanation of these verses, right? So 2 points that are key here, right? 2 points is the idea, one, that there is no harm being spoken about here in terms of physical harms of alcohol. It's the sin that comes from alcohol, the moral the immorality and the moral challenges that come from drinking alcohol that the Quran speaks of. And then even when the Quran talks about benefit, it's not benefits as it relates to the health benefits of drinking alcohol. That's simply just not the concern for the Quran. It is the moral and the questions of morality that come up. And so one of the things that would be raised is, hey, there's a benefit that existed when these people get drunk and they're slaughtering camels and distributing their meat to the poor benefit from this, right? And so what the Quran is saying, yes, certainly the poor benefit from that. But the sin of drinking alcohol, the moral challenges and turpitude that come up from alcohol consumption, that's greater. Right? Okay. So Ghamidi goes on and he says, look, the Khilafah is neither a religious term, nor is its establishment at a global level a directive of Islam. Right? The Khilafah is not a religious term. It has no religious sort of connotation to it. It's not coming out of religion as such, right? And its establishment at a global level is also not a directive of Islam in any way, right? People, he says, essentially have no idea of the history of this concept. It's just a word in the Arabic language, right? It's in fact been used in various meanings, even in the Quran. It is not a technical religious term. It has no religious connotations in his view, right? It has become one, right? It's become in sort of its modern parlance, in the way that we use it, it's kind of become a religious term, but it's not actually a religious term, right? When Abu Bakr Siddiq became the leader of the Muslim community, he was called Khalifa al-Rasul. Then Umar radiallahu anhu was called Khalifa al-Rasul, right? The Caliph of the Prophet, right? So Abu Bakr was the Caliph of the Prophet, Umar is the Caliph of the Prophet. And Umar at that point said, look, this was going to be an issue, right? Because as more people come after him, you'd have to keep adding Khalifa to the title. So instead he said, I'm just going to use the word Amir al-Mu'mineen, right? The leader of the believers. If Khalifa was truly a religious term, then it should have stayed intact. Then Umar would not have imagined using some other term to refer to himself, right? But it was being used in a purely normal linguistic way for a period of time. And then another word, Amir al-Mu'mineen, was seen to be better, so that was used, right? If Khalifa, in Ghamdi's view, had this religious connotation that people assume that it does, then it wouldn't have disappeared in that way and been replaced by the Khalifa Umar, right? Okay, so eventually scholars began to make Khalifa into a technical term, right? But Ghamdi is saying that neither is the term Khilafah a religious term, nor is there a religious directive to establish a Khilafah, right? In the earliest periods, he would say, there were actually two governments, right? There are two governments in the earliest period. The Abbasids in Baghdad and the Umayyads in Andalusia, which remained in existence for centuries. However, the fact that both were in existence was not seen as a violation of Sharia, right? None of the major scholars of Islam said that this was an issue religiously, that this was a religious issue, right? Later on, this does become something that Muslim scholars start to articulate as a religious issue and an obligation that there can't be more than one government, but this wasn't an issue. Religiously, it wasn't an issue. Politically, it might have been, but religiously, it wasn't an issue, right? It didn't get considered to be a violation of the Sharia that you had Abbasids in Baghdad and Umayyads in Andalusia. Because frankly speaking, it couldn't be. There was nothing in the Quran or Sunnah on this, and so it doesn't even appear in the fiqh in the early period. What was said then? What is said by the Prophet, peace be upon him, is that once a Muslim government is established, then rebellion against it is a serious offense, right? You should not engage in efforts to overthrow a Muslim government that has been established. Don't destabilize it, right? Those who do this, the Prophet said, will die a death of jahiliyyah. Right? That is oftentimes this hadith that's put forward that Ghamidi is referencing is this notion or this hadith that talks about the fact that you cannot have two Muslim governments. And what it's talking about there's two sort of separate matters that are being spoken of, right? There's one issue that in one case you have a Muslim government that's been established and then there's an effort to overthrow it. This is wrong. This shouldn't be done. And the Sunnah speaks against this clearly. But that Sunnah, that hadith, that idea is then used to say, oh, Islam requires you to establish one Muslim state. This has no basis in the Quran or Sunnah. That these are two separate matters, right? There's one instance, you have a Muslim government, and what you're basically saying is, hey, we are not going to create instability by popping up a parallel government in that state. There's another one that says, hey, well, actually, and it extrapolates the meaning of this even further and says, oh, you have to go and establish one Muslim state. Right? The Prophet, peace be upon him, said there can't be two Muslim governments in one place. That means we can only have one Muslim government everywhere. That is not the meaning of this, according to Ghamidi. Right? Right? So, creation of religious terminology is different from creating technical language for scholarly purposes, right? This is an important point to bear in mind. Creating religious terminology is different from creating technical language for scholarly purposes. For instance, hadith terminology are not religious terms. They're simply technical language for the science of the study of hadith. Same thing for fiqh, right? All disciplines have their own terms created by human beings. This fiqh terminology is not religious terminology. Religious terminology only comes from God, right? Human terminology can be changed, right? In fiqh, you can talk about something being mubah, makruh, etc., etc. Those are fiqh terms. You can decide to change them, have different categories, right? We have different terms to refer to sort of something that's not a prohibition, but it's not really want to be encouraged, etc. Right? But with religious terminology, they cannot be changed. You cannot decide that we are no longer going to call prayer salat or fasting saum. These are religious terms, right? God and his messengers have established these terms. They have sacred status. They're based on some religious command, on some religious rule, right? And that, as a result, cannot be changed. Right? Those are religious terms, they cannot be changed. But other terms, including for Ghamidi, the idea of the Khilafah, is not a religious term. It's a political term. It's referring to a type of governance. Right? It might have existed in the Islamic past, but that does not automatically make it a religious term. Simply because something exists in the Islamic past does not then give it sacred status. Right? That is part of an overall point he is making, right? And the same goes with regard to terminology, whether we're studying hadith, whether we're studying theology, whether we're studying fiqh, right? Or whether we're studying the political realities of Muslims in the past. Okay, so that's the second point. Inshallah, in the next session, we'll move into the third point that Ghamidi brings up as part of his counter-narrative and try to go through his ideas there. Okay. وأقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم سائر المسلمين الحمد لله رب العالمين